Today, our topic is vulnerability management. Some of you may think that the vulnerability management as a topic originated many years ago, maybe 2010s, 2000s, the 90s, or even before that. I definitely remember discussions about security patching and patching timelines going back many, many years. My presentation was inspired by, of course, recent events, AI-produced vulnerabilities, but also with a concept that I've been fascinated since my analyst days. It's the concept of a patch sound barrier. So the theme today is breaking the patch sound barrier from vulnerability management to VulnOps. I would give you some ideas and thoughts and directions that would hopefully help you reduce the risk rather than just implement specific guidance. Here, the point is that as the times change, we may need to change with the times. As I said, this was inspired by discussions about the maximum patching speed. Sometimes I see guidance online and people kind of explain how fast you should patch, how fast you should really floor it when you see a high-risk vulnerability. And the topic of how fast can you patch is, to me, quite important. And today we're going to talk about not just reducing risks because you should, but reducing risks in the way you can. And while many of us in the industry talk about the coming vulnerability apocalypse, maybe I won't go quite as dramatic. So let's talk about what's coming and then quickly check our assumptions. Is this coming though? Then we're going to do some compare and contrast between the classic vulnerability management as we know it since the 90s and what seems like a more modern approach. We'll discuss the future and a few conclusions about how to reduce risks and make your life better. So this is kind of the well-known realities. Most of us know that, well, as I sometimes joke, hackers hack, adversaries are out to get us. They are, as we know from solid data at this point, use generative AI and at this point also AI agents to accelerate their kill chains, to accelerate their processes. At the same time, many organizations are still running through substantially manual processes on hygiene, on updates, on managing technical debt. To me, these are just facts. Nothing here is contentious. Nothing here would trigger anybody in a helpful way. If you work for very modern organizations that affect you less, if you work for traditional organizations where IT maybe started, I don't know, conservatively in the 70s, you probably would have more of those. Some of you think that AI would magically fix all of this. Short answer is no, but it would certainly find areas where it can help. After this broad framing, let's talk about what many like to call the mythos moment, but I really think of it as an AI moment because it is really not about any particular model. Today, AI rapid progress led us to the place where computers can find vulnerabilities. AI models can find vulnerabilities in existing systems, in software code, in binaries, in firmware at a pretty rapid pace without that much human involvement, and also quickly confirm that these are exploitable. This is important because sometimes I hear people say that there are just going to be more vulnerabilities, but the exploitable risky ones would not increase. I don't think that's the truth. I think both total and exploitable vulnerabilities would go up. Now, exploitable doesn't mean commonly exploited. We obviously know nothing about what would get commonly exploited. The massive explosion of the number of vulnerabilities across the board is largely assured. There may be some signs, there may be some publications about, of course, vulnerabilities in open source projects being published, produced by AI models. Much of it is not contentious. Contentious things would come very soon, though. At this point, I'm kind of describing what is mostly factual. Now, one level down is to look at what is the coming wave. To me, it's not just about there are more CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, recorded vulnerabilities, but there are more CVEs, more vulnerabilities without CVEs, which are known, and more vulnerabilities that are not known to defenders. So I expect increase in CVEs, increase in published vulnerabilities, and increase in 0 days. They're all very easy to predict by just pure extrapolation. So there's nothing contentious. Probably more patches as some organizations get access to those advanced models. They would patch things in their own code. So there would be some silent patches where vulnerability would exist, but hopefully defenders can push the patch out faster. That to me opens up a window for exploitation that may happen. Finally, the timelines to proof of concept code, to usable exploit code would also shrink quite a bit. Things that have taken solid top tier researchers weeks may take, maybe not anybody, but may take somebody with much less skills days and at some point hours and a little budget in AI compute time in tokens. So these are still, some people question a few of those, but ultimately the number of vulnerabilities would increase, the number of exploitables would increase, And it's very possible that they would increase across source and bind. Hopefully nobody is screaming in protest. They don't believe it. It may not happen. At this point, there's still an industry debate about this. But what do we do? One thing that to me is driving the current slow updates or updates that are much slower than the risks. Even today, forget AI, forget all these novel models. In most cases, companies patch issues in commercial off-the-shelf software, in their custom code, slower because they want to test, they want to make sure there are no issues, and the risk equation that is in their heads, in their bosses' heads, maybe in CIOs' heads, is something of that sort. And yes, of course, it depends whether you're patching large enterprise application that's written in 1980s versus some code that you wrote or contractor wrote, 2 weeks ago, and it's very simple. Admittedly, this varies by the type of code, but there is, in many cases, still a gap between what people think they can do and what people need to do based on real. Notice my point about real or imagined. Now, if you have a perception that an update would crash the system, would cause issues with business, you would act on the perception. It doesn't matter if the risk is real. At this point, risk perception is as real for most organizations. Now, this is obviously, I'm a security technologist. Sometimes I want to highlight the fact that not patching obviously causes risk of a compromise, but I've met enough people. Again, some of you know I'm a former Gartner analyst, so I've met people who think that the bad patch would cause issues today, but an undeployed patch may cause issues in the future if you're hacked. So for as long as this picture persists in your head, the change is not going to happen. You're not going to modernize. You're not going to patch faster. And if this whole vulnerability apocalypse wave is real, then you'd suffer pretty grievous harm. I mean, that's also kind of a fact. So if this changes to this, and if this would become accepted reality, let's say in May 2027, I'm just conservatively saying 1 year, this would mean you would change how you operate. And in the rest of the deck, we're going to discuss what those changes are. So imagine this is not a fact. This is my hypothesis that in a year, patching causing issues would be seen as a smaller risk than not patching, because maybe those of us who are old enough and who dealt with security in the mid 2000s, in the age of worms, age of this IIS and Outlook issues, a lot of malware, it was very clear that exploitation was imminent. So the age of imminent exploitation may, in fact, be brought back through the power of AI. Now, a lot of this was kind of abstract, but let me bring it to a little bit of a firm reality. This applies to applications you wrote, your partners wrote, your contractors wrote. It applies to open source. It applies to commercial applications you purchased. It applies to firmware in the devices. And of course, dependencies underlie all that. So the scope of this is quite drastic. And there are different actions we would take. There are different actions that you should take if we are in this world of not patching having been seen as a higher risk. However, of course, dealing with a firmware device, dealing the device firmware versus dealing with code you wrote yourself or downloaded from the internet would be different safeguards. And this is the first slide when I mentioned the word VulnOps. I did not create it. I saw it somewhere online. I failed to trace who started it. I've seen it in quite a few publications and presentations created in this time frame because of the LLM discovery of vulnerabilities. So if you're the author of this concept, please let me know and I'll adjust the slides to mention your name. At this point, VulnOps is this somewhat mythical, somewhat futuristic idea of vulnerability management being done using modern principles, and we'll get to details in a moment. So the fact that the risks of LLM discovering vulns apply to all of that. You should be at least somewhat scared at this point. And again, you may be less scared because of your code, but you should be more scared about the code that comes with OS and other things. So what is the idea? How do we deal with all that? I want to start with everybody's favorite item, namely legacy systems. Now, this is not Anton showing up and saying, hey guys, you have this 1980s enterprise application. You probably can't fix it. Consider just replacing it with something more modern. This is probably the most hated advice in the universe. At least I've met people who were seriously on the receiving end of this, and they did not respond well, because ultimately, just vibe coded is not the recommendation. However, if we truly live in this world where patching has a risk, but not patching has high risks, but you still cannot patch, your options become more limited. We will talk in detail about mitigation, and the bottom right box about mitigation is just adding more and more different safeguards to an application you cannot patch. There's nothing new about it, but I've looked at the paper I wrote while at Gartner in 2017, which had a beautiful structure for organizing your mitigation. So a lot of this is known for at least 10 years, but really many more years. Modern replacement, cloud native replatforming, which is essentially a fancy term rewriting it in a modern way, whether you use AI or not. And of course, decommissioning target systems, decommissioning target capabilities. Sometimes the answer is not that you have to burn the entire system, but you have to turn off things will become more important. Again, none of them are new. But in this world of not patching, higher risk than patching, some of the old ideas has to come back to life, and the certain really onerous, really painful replacements would become sort of on the menu. They would come back on the menu. Let's put it this way. This is the well-known, you can clearly see the AI created picture here. I kind of call it mitigation, so when you truly can't. There will be examples where you have a system, it is vulnerable, it is with high risk vulnerabilities, and you cannot patch it. In this case, you're doing layers, and whether you're doing something very old school like NAC from mid 2000s or firewalls from the late 1980s or any other technologies, the point is that you are adding layers, and some of those layers have software, firmware with vulnerabilities. So attackers will have exploits for those as well. Whether you go with something classic like WAF or even network intrusion prevention technology or anything more modern like EDR, you are still adding layers to a system you cannot patch. People have invented ADR for application detection and response. There is also application posture management. There are many acronyms, some going back 20 years, some very new, but the idea is still the same. You would add layers. And of course, if you can disconnect the system, that's a really good layer. It may or may not be enough. And of course, it may not be, may or may not make your business. There's a lot of science on planning mitigations. And in a 20-minute presentation, I probably wouldn't share most of the science with you. But if you forgot the word mitigation, you better remember it because, as I said, in this world, as a reminder, if you can't decommission the system, if you cannot patch the system, but you have to deal with the risk. Unfortunately, the answer is mitigations. Now, what about things that you can change? Admittedly, I'm not an AppSec person. I like to admit this in social media or in public that my focus expertise is not AppSec. But I've met enough people who really still think of AppSec as you hire a consultant who does some testing that gives you a PDF, and then you give it to developers and say, you guys should fix those issues. Now, modern companies have not been doing this for many years, if not a decade, or maybe more than one decade, but I still see vestiges of this in other organizations. So if this becomes a classic vulnerability management versus VulnOps, you're trying to do things in a much tighter loop and in much smaller chunks. It's kind of, well, I guess the DevOps, but for vulnerability management. The funny analogy I would use from my other area of expertise, namely security operations or detection and response, is that just like we have modern SOC, which is inspired by DevOps, kind of what we used to call autonomous security operations or ASO, modern VulnOps is the domain of vulnerability management reorganized based on DevOps. This is, again, way easier said than done, but for the code you can touch, this is probably the only way to do things. One of the absolutely magical elements of this, which you absolutely cannot not get right, is testing. Because if you think that you patch slowly because your testing is manual and done at human speed, well, under the vulnerability apocalypse conditions, it wouldn't cut it. You would have to validate quickly because otherwise you're patching. Again, the same slide about risk being higher will kind of crash. And so you have to study how organizations have done it, and people have done it. A lot of things are done at massive scale. I shouldn't go far from examples like Chrome being patched automatically across many systems. This is kind of one of those examples where billions of systems are patched within a short period of time, and they're done with dramatic safety record. So in that sense, we humanity kind of know how to do it. We just in many cases choose not to. Now, this is the fun part, and you may or may not like this, but it's a thought experiment, and I've run it a few times with a few colleagues in the industry, and it's the reverse thinking approach, not the straight through thinking. So imagine that you open your eyes, you wake up tomorrow, and actually you can deploy patches to any of your systems in 15 minutes. And I mean software, custom, firmware, anything. It's an absolute magical world. It won't happen anytime soon, but imagine you're in it. So what has changed in your environment to make this happen? What has changed to make you patch things within 15 minutes? Now, the list may be really long. The list may include impossible items. The list may include items that may never happen at your company, but it's still a very useful exercise, as I have discovered. What you can do with this is that you may not patch all systems in 15 minutes tomorrow or any day after. But as you start thinking, what would have happened in your company, in your environment, to enable patch within 15 minutes would reveal some lessons about what you can actually do. And frankly, if you think you want one thing that pays for your ticket to this webinar, it may be this experiment. Try imagining what has changed in your environment that enabled you to patch systems in 15 minutes. This would be fun. This would be stressful. Think of it as maybe a tabletop exercise of some sort. And I swear it would give you useful ideas that you can actually implement. Now, I don't want to go deep into the how it can be achieved. But just as you know, cats versus cattle analogy from cloud native versus traditional systems, I stole another great metaphor from somebody. And again, if you're that person, please come up and say, yeah, I'm the author, where you're not just doing cats to cattle from unique hand-maintained, hand-patched risky systems to kind of more standardized systems, but you move even further to tiny, highly replaceable micro workloads that are continuously built, kind of more insects than cattle. To me, this also enables a lot of this instant 15-minute patching thought experiment. This is, again, not easy. A lot of redoing, a lot of re-architecting, a lot of modernizing. But again, if we are in this world, suddenly we are much more motivated to do things that are drastic. Quick reminder about what will not save you. Simply pushing your operational effectiveness. There is absolutely no way to streamline patching of a legacy database from 90 days to 3 days. There's nothing you can do. You can maybe change it from 90 days to 60 days through enormous effort. But if you have to patch it in 2 days, the answer is you're not going to do it. So the operational hustle fallacy is a fallacy. You're not going to streamline your way to the timelines you need. And the other one is my other favorite thing. In my Gartner days, I used to call it prioritization trap or prioritization answer is, if we have 1 million vulns, can we just prioritize so that we can only fix the risky ones? Yes, but if you successfully prioritize the 1,000 vulns to 10, now you have 1 million. Okay, so even if percentage of exploitables is lower, you still have a huge number that you must patch. So in that sense, prioritization is not an answer. You probably want to prioritize better, sure. But ultimately, you want to build automation like we described. It won't be just scoring. Sure, replacing CVSS with EPSS will give benefits, and there may be other things you can do to prioritize better. But if top priority, real risky top priority is more than you can do, then you exhausted the opportunities of priority. A lot of people contest it when I hypothesize that we can, in fact, end up largely vulnerability-free code. Enough people, at least here and in many other organizations that deal with AI, have seen the future, and they are seeing the fact that producing vulnerability-free replacements that are modernized replacements for existing software is in fact real. So you may not believe me. I'm very easy that way. Just wait a couple of years and we'll know who's right. This is not something we have to wait until the 2030. It would happen much faster. Same with self-healing code bases when agents refactor them. And of course, complete path to eliminating the idea of patching the running system. Again, pets to cattle to insects means that you're not patching anything that's in prod. You're kind of slowly running the wave of updates through things. This is very futuristic, but the future is coming. And the idea here is that because of that changes in risk equation, we will have to do it the modern way, or bad things would happen at scale with large damage. In that sense, looking forward to seeing how the future unfolds and looking forward to supporting you on your journey.